Nico.
Good morning to you and also to all the listeners.
Now, I just want to say that part of Nico's story today and what he's going to be talking about takes me back, because before where we are now, if you wanted to have something to listen to it again, you had to ask for it on cassette tape. TDK was the preferred, more expensive, quote unquote, better quality. That was the fancy one, exactly. But Nico, it's one of those questions I think that every believer, every follower of Jesus Christ has to deal with. Has God called me to what I'm doing? Am I doing what I'm supposed to be doing?
And that's why I've chosen this particular theme, because two listeners made that exact comment. And I was thinking, why are you even doubting?
Yeah.
Why are you asking that question?
Sure.
Well, I spent 15 years of my life working with youth leaders. And I would travel around South Africa. I would settle in a congregation for 1 to 3 month period of time, and I would then work with the leaders. And sometimes it would be in one congregation. Sometimes, if it was a village, the congregations would work together. So there would be a non-denominational exercise that we would be working together with. And in one particular community, I was due to start on the Sunday evening. And everything had been set up, and the idea was that I would address the congregation so that the parents would know what I was going to do with the youth leaders, with their members as well.
Yeah.
And early on the Sunday morning, I got a phone call from the pastor who was sick, and he was not going to be able to make the morning service where he was supposed to preach. And so he said, look, can you speak in the morning and the evening service, and just use your evening sermon in the morning, and then you've got the whole day to prepare for another service. And
put you on the spot a little bit.
You had to do that. That's what you were there for. So off I rushed to the church, and I arrived, and immediately they put on the robe that I was required to wear, and they added the lapel mic.
Oh, one of those cordless ones.
That's one of those cordless ones. And off I rushed to get into the pulpit. Now, this pulpit was one of those that are built like a chariot.
Oh.
The congregation sees you from the front, but they don't see what happens behind the pulpit.
Okay.
Now, the first challenge that I faced is that in that congregation, the minister was not very tall.
Okay.
And the first time he got into the pulpit, nobody could see much of the minister. Now, what happens with congregations is often they're allergic to spending money to fix problems.
True story.
Which meant in that particular pulpit, they had to raise the level of the floor. And of course, being leaders and wanting to be good stewards, they had to do so on the cheap. And they decided the way to do that on the cheap was to use cold drink cases.
Those plastic ones.
No, those days it was wood.
Oh, yes,
so
that's
they got
right.
the wooden
like
cases
bashes,
that Pepsi Cola used, and they stacked them up in the pulpit so that when the pastor got in the pulpit, the congregation could see what they were paying for.
Yes.
Now, the problem was I'm 1.83 meters tall.
So it was too tall for you.
Too tall. And as I got into the pulpit and started climbing up the stairs, the congregation realized what was now happening. Because not only were they seeing me from the shoulders upwards, they were seeing me almost the whole of me down there.
Wow.
And well, there's nothing I could do. At least I had the attention of everybody, and they were all giggling to see what
over them.
And when I preach, I use a lot of illustrations, and I also move around a lot. And at the most dramatic part of my sermon, I leant forward to make the point. I was a lot bigger than I was now, and my stomach touched the reading light, which was hot.
Because in those days, we did not have LED lamps.
It was just a hot
Super
light.
hot.
And I suddenly felt this piercing pain in my stomach. I stepped back and fell out of the pulpit.
Yeah.
Now, it would have been nice if I just shut up when I landed on the floor. I'd forgotten about the lapel mic. And I made a couple of observations. The first observation is, why is it that when men fix things, they always end up fixing it in such a way that it's not fixed. That got me half of the audience immediately, because the women all understood exactly what I was saying.
All the wives.
Of course you.
Exactly
Nudging
what I
their
was
husbands.
saying. That's exactly it. And then I also observed that it was really not fair on the leaders of the church, the way they were sometimes treated in our attempt to save money. And then I realized I've now got to get back into this pulpit and not only have the congregation now heard, because I could hear over the speakers
What you
they'd
were
heard.
saying, you're mumbling.
And then I realized, but they're also recording this conversation at the back, because on Monday they had tapes of that was going to go to everybody who was at home and housebound.
Yeah.
And they were going to be able to hear what had happened to me on Sunday and hear what I had said. And now I was going to have to spend another month with that congregation. It was going to affect what I was going to have to say and do.
Exactly.
Anyway, I finished the service. I made my way to the pastor to go and say to him, what do we do now? Because I'm not comfortable now. I've messed up for you. I've messed things up. And by then, of course, he'd not only had the leadership phone him, women phoning and saying it's about time we listened to what that man had said. And he'd also got phone calls from the ministers fraternal, because they'd also heard what happened. And they were saying, would he mind if they attended the evening service? Because they wanted to hear what this youth leader was saying, because they agreed with what their experience in their congregation was as well. So he said, no, you have to speak in the evening and we will ride it out. It's not going to be a problem.
Yeah.
That evening, as I arrived at the service, the first thing I noticed, there was no parking anywhere. Everybody had pitched. When I finally got into the actual church, the guy doing the cassette say I'd broken all the records of that congregation. He had used up all his spare cassettes, and he was hoping he could get enough in the village to fill the rest of the orders.
Wow.
As I got into the pulpit itself, the congregation realized the cold drink cases had now been removed, because they saw what they were required to see.
Yes.
And I started off by saying, thank you for removing the cases. I feel a lot safer now than I felt earlier this morning. But the point I'm trying to make now to you, and also to those listeners who commented to me, if God calls me to do something, God's not calling me because I'm perfect. God's calling me because I have to do it. When Jesus chose his disciples and he sent them out in ministry, they had fights amongst each other about who is more important. They brought their families to have fights with Jesus about who was going to be the leader of the disciples. That was reality. If we are chosen to do something, our response is to be obedient. That's what our response is. And if we doubt that, we're suggesting God doesn't know what God is doing. So we're hitting that season of the year when there are kids who are hungry, when there are kids who need to receive some kind of special experience because of what's happening to us. So I want to say, if you're hearing the prompting from God, your response is to be obedient and not to worry that you can mess up such an extent that God can't do what he wants to do. So it's just a matter of being obedient. And if I couldn't mess up God's plan, I promise you, you're not going to be able to mess it up either.
Brilliant.
Have a good day.
Thank you so much, Nico Kleynhans.